August 6, 1895. Attached to our train from Missoula Station were two special cars bearing an excursion party consisting of the new receiver of the Northern Pacific Railroad and his friends, one of whom we were told was the United States Supreme Court judge who had appointed this receiver. An invitation was sent in to Mark to ride in their car, but as it came for him alone and did not include the ladies, he declined. The Bitterroot Valley was the ancestral home of the Salish tribe of the Flathead Nation. In early September 1805, the Lewis and Clark expedition crossed Lost Trail Pass from present-day Idaho in order to connect with the overland route through the Rocky Mountains, passing down Camp Creek and the East Fork. They followed the Bitterroot River northward to the point where it connects with the Nez Perce Trail and Lolo Creek. Before continuing their difficult journey to the west, they named their camp Traveler's Rest, returning to this site in early July of the following year. They split their corps of discovery, furthering their explorations both to the northeast, Lewis, and to the south, Clark. The first white settlement in the valley was the founding in 1841 of St. Mary's Mission, near present-day Stevensville, by Father De Smet. Fort Owen was established nearby in 1850, and difficult relations occurred between the white settlers and the Salish until 1891, when the native tribes were located to the north. In 1877, Chief Joseph and the Nez Perce tribe passed south through the Bitterroot Valley, fleeing the U.S. Army. They exited the East Fork via Gibbons Pass, near where they fought at the Battle of the Big Hole. Arlee. It was named for the Salish leader Arlee. In October 1873, he moved a small group of his people from the Bitterroot Valley, a conditional reservation according to the 1855 Hellgate Treaty, to the Jocko Agency, later known as the Flathead Indian Agency, located a few miles south of the town of Arlee. This forced move stemmed from the efforts of a congressional delegation led by future President James Garfield to negotiate a Salish removal from the Bitterroot Valley. Now, the Indians of Arlee have a celebration that happens to fall on the 4th of July. The earliest evidence of an attempt to hold a 4th of July powwow was in 1891. In the 1890s, however, traditional Indian dances were illegal under Bureau of Indian Affairs rules, and the Indian police and the Flathead Indian agent, Peter Ronan, used the threat of U.S. Army intervention to break up the dance. The Bureau of Indian Affairs found it difficult to argue that it should be illegal to celebrate the 4th of July, though for a time government attempts to suppress traditional dances forced the tribes to hold them secretly. Because of this persecution, we cannot at this time establish definitively when the first 4th of July powwow was actually held. The second Indian agency on the Blackfeet Reservation was built in 1879 at Old Agency at the bend in the Flathead River. Agent John Young moved the buildings from Upper Badger Creek with help from the Blackfeet Indians. Both men and women dug cellars, hauled stone, and mixed mortar. The women covered the exterior with lime from Hart Butte. The Indians called it Old Ration Place after the government began issuing rations there. The starvation winter of 1883-1884 took the lives of about 500 Blackfeet Indians who had been camping in the vicinity of Old Agency. This was the result of an inadequate supply of government rations during an exceptionally hard winter. In 1894, after the Great Northern Railway extended its tracks across the reservation, the agency moved to Willow Creek at the present site in Browning. The Flathead River originates in the Canadian Rockies to the north of Glacier National Park and flows southwest into Flathead Lake. Then, after a journey of 158 miles, it empties into the Clark Fork. It's part of the Columbia River drainage basin. The river has a drainage basin extending over 8,795 square miles and an average discharge of 11,380 cubic feet per second. The Flathead is the largest tributary of the Clark Fork and constitutes over half of its flow. Wild Horse Plains, nestled in a circular valley at an elevation of 2,450 feet, drained by the Clark Fork River. During the Pleistocene glacial periods, glaciers dammed the Clark Fork River Valley, creating glacial Lake Missoula. The ice dams broke periodically, and at that time, the Clark Fork River carried more water than the combined flow of all the streams of the world. The Missoula Floods, also known as the Spokane Floods or the Brett's Floods. The waters of the lake would rush down the Clark Fork and the Columbia River, flooding much of eastern Washington and the Willamette Valley in western Oregon. After the rupture, the ice would reform and recreate glacial Lake Missoula. During the last deglaciation, it's estimated that a cycle of flooding and reformation of the lake lasted an average of 55 years. and that the floods occurred several times over the 2,000-year period between 15 and 13,000 years ago. There is evidence of at least 25 massive floods, the largest discharging 13 times the Amazon River. Estimates for the peak flow rate of the largest flood include 17 cubic kilometers per hour and range up to 60 cubic kilometers per hour. Maximum flow speed approached 80 miles per hour. It's been estimated that the oldest of the Pleistocene Missoula floods happened before 1.5 million years ago, but because of the fragmentary nature of older glaciofluvial deposits, which have largely been removed by subsequent Missoula floods, the exact number of older Missoula floods cannot be estimated with any confidence. In the early 1800s, Native American tribes traveled through the area. The fertile valley was used for wintering their ponies, harvesting salmon, and holding great councils. Mountain men, trappers, surveyors, and map makers were soon to follow. White settlers began their movement into the valley in the late 1860s. During the decades to follow, farming, ranching, and lumbering would flourish in the valley. The Northern Pacific Railway arrived in 1881 to 1883, and the town began to increase in size and importance. Businesses flourished, and eventually the name was shortened to Horse Plains, finally to Plains. Thompson Falls, named after British explorer, geographer, and fur trader David Thompson, founded a fur trading post called Salish House in 1808. The arrival of the railroad in 1881 brought the first real activity to the area, and 2 years later, the gold rush hit nearby Coeur d'Alene. The town grew to accommodate the men going over the Murray Trail to the mines, and in 1885, John Russell bought 40 acres and plotted the town site. The Thompson Falls Dam is constructed right on top of the waterfalls. In the 19th century, the Clark Fork Valley was inhabited by the Flathead tribe of Native Americans. It was explored by Meriwether Lewis of the Lewis and Clark expedition during the 1806 return trip from the Pacific. The river is named for William Clark. A middle segment of the river in Montana was formerly known as the Missoula River. The river was also referred to as the Deer Lodge River by Granville Stewart. David Thompson used the name Salish River for the entire Flathead, Clark Fork, Pendoral river system. For most of the first half of the 19th century, the Clark Fork River and surrounding region was controlled by the British Canadian Northwest Company and Hudson's Bay Company. In the mid-19th century, the Clark Fork River wound through the valley where cattle had replaced bison. This was when Conrad Coors purchased a ranch from Johnny Grant that is now called the Grant Coors Ranch. Since the late 19th century, many areas in the watershed of the river have been extensively mined for minerals, resulting in ongoing stream pollution. Most pollution has come from the copper mines in Butte and the smelter in Anaconda. Many of the most polluted areas have been designated as Superfund sites. Nevertheless, the river and its tributaries are among the most popular destinations for fly fishing in the United States. Today, the Clark Fork watershed encompasses the largest Superfund site in America as a mega site and includes 3 major sites: Butte, Anaconda, and Milltown Dam, Clark Fork River's Milltown Reservoir Superfund site. Each of these major sites is split up into numerous sub-sites known as operable units. Remediation and or restoration of these sites is ongoing. Herrin, Montana. Before the railroad arrived, the lower Clark Fork River Valley was very quiet, traveled seasonally by the local Salish and Kootenai peoples, then by the occasional fur trapper and adventurer following on the heels of David Thompson. Steep mountains, rain, snow, and river rapids made travel challenging. Camps were temporary, used only for berry picking, camas digging, fishing, and hunting. They then moved on. Originally a railroad town on the Northern Pacific, the North Pacific Railway reached Herrin in 1882. Within a year, Herrin had about 400 residents, 3 stores, 6 saloons, 2 hotels, 2 restaurants, and a town water system. In January 1884, Herrin's first post office was opened. In September, the first school district was created. By October 1888, the water source for the steam engines dried up, and the railroad terminal moved to Hope, Idaho. The post office closed before Thanksgiving, and Herrin was almost wiped from the map. People left in droves. A few stubborn folks hung in there, and eventually a new wave of migrants arrived, lured by out-of-region promoters. This cycle repeated itself many times over the decades. Herrin has been rebuilt and reinvented numerous times, lured by the promise of something better. Homesteaders, farmers, trappers, miners, loggers, business owners continued to arrive. Some endured. Many moved on when the extolled riches never materialized, or were burnt up in the frequent fires or lost to the spring floods. It was an enjoyable ride to Spokane, where we arrived at 11:30 and put up at the Spokane House, the largest hotel I ever saw. It was a large commercial building covering an entire block, revamped into a hotel. A whole store was diverted into one bedroom, and nicely furnished, too. Reporters were in waiting to interview the distinguished guest. Mark is gaining strength and is enjoying everything. So the interviewers had a good time. August 7th, Sam sees squaws prowling about back doors and windows, begging and foraging. A nuisance once familiar to me, he said. We found here a magnificent new theater, the Opera House. It has cost over $200,000 and was never yet a quarter filled. The manager was greatly disappointed at the receipts for the lecture. He had counted on a full house. Where he expected the people to come from, I don't know. The receipts were not much better than in Missoula. Mark didn't enjoy it and manifested no delicacy in so expressing himself. Reviews, however, were quite good. We spent all day August 8th in Spokane. In the forenoon, Mark and I walked about this remarkable city with its asphalt streets, electric lights, 9-story telegraph poles, and commercial blocks that would do credit to any eastern city. There were buildings 10 stories high, with the 9 top stories empty, and there were many fine stores with great plate glass fronts marked "To Rent." In the afternoon, our entire party drove about the city in an open carriage. Our driver pointed out some beautiful suburban residences and told us who occupied them. "That house," he said as we drove by a palatial establishment, "is where Mr. Brown lives. He is receiver for the Spokane Bank, which failed last year for over $2 million. You all know about that big failure, of course. The receiver lives there." Pointing out another house, he said, "That man living up in that big house is receiver for the Great Falls Company. It failed for nearly $1 million. The president and directors of that company are most all in the state prison. And this here house that we're coming to now is where the receiver of the Washington Gas and Water Company lives, etc." Mark said to the ladies, if I had a son to send west, I would educate him for a receiver. It seems to be about the only thriving industry. As we have a day here, the ladies have overhauled and repacked their trunks. I think there is no occupation that has the fascination for women when traveling as the unpacking and overhauling of large traveling trunks. They go at it early, miss their luncheon, and are late to dinner, and yet show no signs of fatigue. There was another incident here. Our ladies dressed their best for dinner and outshone the receiver's excursionists who occupied most of the great dining hall. Mark didn't see it, as he never comes down to dinner. I know I saw it and enjoyed a feeling of pride. I just felt and knew I was envied by the men at the other tables. Clara Clemens is a beautiful girl, and as we passed out of the dining room into the great parlor, she sat down at the Chickering grand piano and began playing a Chopin nocturne. It was in the gloaming. Stealthily, guests came in from dinner and sat breathlessly in remote parts of the boundless room, listening to a performance that would have done credit to any great pianist. Never have I witnessed a more beautiful sight than this sweet brunette unconsciously holding a large audience of charmed listeners. If it was not one of the supreme moments of her mother's life who saw and heard her, then I have guessed wrong. It was an incident forever fixed in my memory. That night at 11:30 we went aboard the sleeper on the Great Northern Road. Everything was in readiness for us.